Aloha and good morning. I'm Ronalyn with Hawaii's BBB and welcome to our webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few things to help you get the most out of this presentation. You should see two windows on your screen, the presentation window and the control panel in the upper right corner. To enlarge and minimize the control panel, click the black arrows on the upper right corner. Here you can adjust your audio settings and send your questions. We will answer your questions after the webinar. Today, our guest speaker is Tillis Harris, whose background is in statistics and database design, but his ongoing passion is using technology to help others succeed in business. His accomplishments include having been the COO for Wildgate Wireless, a mainland telecommunications carrier, where he built and managed staffs and statewide data network. He later helped to pioneer the Best Buy Geek Squad business pilot program, where he established a presence in the Hawaii business community. He is currently the owner of SOS Tech Solutions and directs company projects out of the Manoa Innovation Center. You may recognize him from speaking engagements or appearances on the KHNL Morning News or his weekly Think Tech Friday TV show. He enjoys talking at events and spending time with his wife and 2 children. So now I'll hand it over to Attila.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ronalyn, for that introduction. My name is Tillis Harris. And like Ronalyn said, my focus is really helping businesses use technology to be more strategic and improve profitability. Today, I'm going to share how you can improve customer service, reduce telecommunication operating expenses by re-examining how you interface with customers over the phone. Now, I know that you're likely on this webinar for one of 2 reasons. That's either one, your business phone presence is plagued with call quality issues and you're looking for help, or 2, you have a pretty good phone presence between you and your customers and you're looking for ways to reduce operating expenses and perhaps take advantage of new technologies to improve your customer service. Maybe use features that could facilitate business growth. Either way, whether you're in Camp 1 or Camp 2, you're not alone. And this relatively short presentation should be of immense value and guidance. I recommend that you take notes. Many of the points we will be talking about today may give you good ideas that you can implement in your organization today. Now, for those of you who have seen my presentations before, you may know that I like to start with a story. But this time I'm going to start by talking about Kevin O'Leary. That's the man in the center of the picture right there in front of you. For those of you unfamiliar with the show, Shark Tank. In the show, entrepreneurs with great ideas present their business opportunities to a room full of sharks or investors. They put their own money on the line to help grow the business if they find that it has merit, and they in turn earn a profit in the process. At dead center there is Kevin O'Leary. He's the shrewd, he's the brutally honest, and some would call the meanest shark of the 5 investors. And he feels like he speaks on behalf of money, and he tells it like it is. People like that about him. After a failed deal, his famous slogan is, "You're dead to me." And, that's going to spring a chuckle from any seasoned viewer. Now, a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of hearing Mr. O'Leary speak and then shaking hands with him afterward. Yeah, that's me there in the picture. And, of course, if you're interested in talking about it, feel free to reach out. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. Either way, a big part of Mr. O'Leary's philosophy is that if you've been successful, you really do owe it to pass on the wisdom, the knowledge, the experience you've gained to the next generation of entrepreneurs. In fact, Shark Tank is truly an avenue where Mr. O'Leary can put his money where his mouth is. He deploys his hard-earned money, or what he calls soldiers, to work in the hands of others. He feels that the lessons of business, they won't change in 1,000 years, maybe only the venue. He mentioned that, who knows, you may one day be buying a Coke on a starship. What's fascinating about this show is its success. Why does a 9-year-old, which is Shark Tank's youngest viewer demographic, why do they love the show? Why was it successful in Canada as the Dragon's Den and most successful in America? It's been increasing in popularity every 6 years running. It's a phenomenon, and what Mr. O'Leary shared with us may change the way that you interpret the show from now on. He really feels that Shark Tank has been so successful because it is the very essence of the American dream. The show's not about money or greed, but it's about freedom. Becoming a success on the show and the platform on which it stands, it is to become financially independent. That is freedom. The idea that anyone with a good idea, whether it's cupcakes in a jar, a sponge with a face on it, or a family recipe for barbecue sauce, can show and bring their products to the world and become financially independent in the process, that's what America is all about. Now you're probably wondering what Kevin O'Leary has to do with today's webinar. It's because I'm going to share with you some insider information. This is something he shared with us in the audience. He said there's a recent trend in the investment world. Investment groups are looking for service companies, particularly IT services companies. They're looking for ones which have customer service ratings that fall into the bottom quartile in rank in customer service for their industry. For those of you unfamiliar with statistics, a quartile is 25%. So Q1, which is the bottom quartile, that's the lowest 25% in industry customer service ranking. So what happens? The investors come in, they buy the company, and they change only one thing, the customer service. They don't change the service offering, the production, the logo, anything. Only the customer service. Now, after 12 months of focused improvement on that customer service, they try to bring that company's ranking up to Q4. So that's the top 25% of customer service in their industry. Then, here's the magic part. They raise their customers' service fees by 15%. Let me repeat that. They raise their customers' service fees by 15%. The result is no attrition. In other words, customers are willing to take the pain of a price increase in exchange for good customer service. Attrition is a customer falling off. No customer fall off. So to an investor, that's a 15% return, and that's really attractive. Mr. O'Leary, his new experiment is to find out exactly how high, over 15%, the service fees can be raised and still maintain that zero attrition. Is it 20%? Is it 30%? Who knows? My question to you, though, is, can this be done in your company? Why can't it be done? Can you improve customer service? Can you raise rates? Can you bring more value to the marketplace? Take a good hard look at the way you treat your customers on the phone, because it's still the primary interface for most businesses. Let me ask you 3 quick questions. Do you regularly review your phone bill, say annually, to see if there are services and features that you're not using that might help improve your business? Do you review your phone bill to see if you're over-provisioned? What that means is that you have more lines, services, features than you actually need. You have a standardized answer script and review recorded calls for quality assurance. Reviewing calls sometimes means listening in on those calls as well. Do you do that? Today we're going to cover quite a bit, and some of these topics are going to be relevant to you. We're going to look at the 10 most common business phone issues. These are issues that you've likely come across. It's nice to have them on a neat, easy-to-reference list. We're going to look at the 2 types of phone service out there for businesses and how you can use them to your advantage. And then we'll go through some of these acronyms that the phone company may use to try to bamboozle you, and a case study on how a local business did it right, and how you can learn from their example. At the end, we'll have a few minutes for questions and answer. So if you do have questions throughout the program, feel free to put them into the chat window. That's going to be on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll see them and we'll answer them at the end. There's an added bonus for you. If you hang on until the end, there's a free 10 questions you should ask your business phone service provider today. I recommend reading this before you pay your next phone bill. It's these very vital 10 questions. I'm going to give you the URL for that at the very end. And included with that 10-question report are some of the important notes that go along with this presentation. So if you do get stuck writing things down, don't you worry. I'll be at the end of the presentation. You can download them there. Now, before we get rolling, I know that there are some of you here today that I haven't spoken to before. So for these folks, let me briefly introduce myself. My name, of course, is Attila. I provide really simple, easy to implement security solutions, backup solutions, and phone solutions for small to medium-sized businesses here on Oahu. As Ronald mentioned, I have worked with Hawaii businesses since 2006. I started with the Best Buy's Geek Squad Business Technology Division, and you may have heard or seen me on appearances on KITV, KHON, KHNL, Think Tech, or AM 760. But really, there's one reason I get out of bed in the morning, and that's to help others leverage technology so they can accomplish their dreams. That's why I'm here today. Sam Walton, founder of Sam's Club and Walmart, he once said that the goal of a company is to have customer service that is not just the best, but legendary. Let me ask you this. How do your customers perceive your company? Following in the vein of the Shark Tank theme, Mark Cuban said, "Make your product easier to buy than your competition, or you will find your customers buying from them, not you." Are you easy to interact with on the phone? Is it easy to pay for your services? These are some important questions you should examine with yourself, but today we're just going to focus on your phones. Have you ever had this happen to you? I know I have. You've called a business in your neighborhood, and by the time that the employee finally gets around to answering that phone call, after several rings, they answer in such a way that's just impossible to understand. You ever tried to talk to a business on the phone and there's kind of a delay in them hearing you? There's these strange echoes on the line. The sound is choppy. It's warbly. It sounds like you're almost talking underwater. And you may have to call them back once or twice because there's these unexplained dropped calls. That can get really old really quick. How about error messages? You ever called a business and maybe you're routed to an extension or voicemail and you get an error message? Something like, "That extension is not available," or "Voicemail box not initialized," or "Invalid entry. Please try again." I hear that one a lot. You know what's worse than that? Is having your customers complain to you of these issues. They've called your office. They can't understand who's picking up the phone. There's sound, echoes, choppiness on the line. Or they get error messages when they try to reach you. Now, of course, I don't like to point out any issues or problems without offering some solutions. So here's 3 quick ones based on just these 3 most common things. If the staff member who's picking up the phone call is unintelligible, I recommend a cheap and easy fix. Write and practice an answer script with your employees. I'm going to repeat that. Write and practice an answer script with your employees. If you want to go one step further, you can record or listen in on phone calls for quality control. But Hawaii is a bit unique. Statute 803.42 mentions that we are a one-party consent state when it comes to call recording. What that means is that only one person, obviously on the 2 ends of the line, needs to know that the call is being recorded. That can be your employee, or you can mention it to the customer, but you don't have to. The employee, as long as they know that they're being recorded, that's perfectly legal. There is, of course, one step further to that, which is if you rebroadcast that conversation, say over the airwaves, if you're obviously in radio or television, then both people need to know that it's going out. But otherwise, you can do that just fine. We mentioned earlier poor call quality. These drop calls, transmission delays, echoing, choppy audio, these are all classic signs of a call going over the internet using voice over IP. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that in a minute. But what it really means is that it's a poor connection. It's often not a simple fix, and you usually do have to call a professional. And many times it's sometimes best just to use standard phone lines. Voice over IP works fantastic. This is actually how you're hearing my voice now. But at times it can be problematic. And placing your business at risk because of this, because of call quality issues, is not a good idea. Lastly is error messages. Remember, we're talking about voicemail box not initialized, extension not available. Nothing's more frustrating to a customer than dead-end calls, error messages. Here's my fix for that. Pretend that you're a customer and call your own office line. Make sure that all of your functions and features are working correctly. If they're not, call a pro and get them fixed. I've identified for you 10 of the most common business phone issues. And I recommend that your customers don't catch you with your pants down with these problems. Have you ever had your phone ring forever without it being answered? Have you ever had a phone answered by an employee who does not have a memorized script, or there's an unprofessional recording on the voicemail box? For example, there's no name announcement. It just says, leave a message, go ahead. The staff is not trained on how to put calls on hold, how to transfer calls, how to screen calls, how to send calls to voicemail, and so on. How about voicemail boxes? They're not set up or maintained. Oftentimes I'll call a business and I'll listen to their staff directory, and there'll be a few employees in that staff directory that are no longer there. That's pretty unprofessional. And sometimes when they bring in new hires, they don't end up in the staff directory until much later. Also unprofessional. How about he said, she said conversations without the ability to go back and listen to those phone calls? This is pretty common with retail. Customer will say one thing, employee will say another, and the manager is stuck in the middle, unable to reconcile. Recording those phone calls would solve that problem. Have you ever called a voicemail box and heard these really lengthy voicemail instructions? Having a greeting that's longer than 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, by the time that the customers listen to that voicemail instruction, they've probably forgotten why they've called. So keep it short, keep it simple, concise. Thank you for calling ABC Business. Please leave a message after the tone. We'll call you back shortly. That's all you need. How about a complicated IVR? IVR, I'm going to use this acronym quite a bit, is short for Interactive Voice Response. Some of you know this as a phone tree, where press 1 for sales, 2 for customer service, and so on. That can tend to lose and confuse callers if it's more than one level deep. What that means is when someone calls in, they press 1 for sales, 2 for customer service. If they go one level further than that, which is press 1 for sales for A product, or press 2 for sales for B product, if you go any deeper than that, typically customers get lost. So you want to keep it no more than one level deep. No one likes static hums or crackling on the line. We'll talk about how that can be a problem. But in general, get those problems fixed quick. Customers often won't complain about them right away, even though you can hear them on the line. They'll just kind of wash it up to maybe you being unprofessional, and it could be a missed opportunity. Of course, we talked about choppy voice quality, delays and echoes, and frequently dropped calls. These are, in my opinion, unacceptable. And this list will be available at the end of the presentation. Just hang on for that. Now let's look at the two different types of phone service. Some you may know quite a bit about, some you may not. So we're going to spend a little bit of time going through two different types. This is a traditional phone service. That's the stuff you see on telephone poles and more recently dug underground. And then there's voice over IP. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on voice over IP just because it is unfamiliar territory for most of our listeners. Traditional phone service, I'm sure you've seen this before. These are RJ11 lines. These phone lines you probably had in your house. They're probably in your business. And each of these lines can have 1 to 2 phone lines on each of these cables. High capacity lines, or T1s or PRA lines, these are for more commercial applications and are very common, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But PRI stands for Primary Rate Interface. That's used to provide ISDN. The ISDN is Integrated Services Digital Network. When you see these acronyms kind of thrown around, what you really need to know is that a T1 has 24 simultaneous calls, and a PRI has got 23. To be fair, T1s are not used as often as they used to be. We used to use them quite a bit, but this was years ago. PRIs are more flexible, they're faster, and in terms of call processing, and they can be muxed, same like a T1, but you can be muxed, and what that means is that you can mix voice and data over one physical cable. You'll notice that the connection there looks like an Ethernet port. It does look like an Ethernet jack typically, and it still uses copper lines to go from point A to point B, or of course fiber if you're breaking out. But I think that's a little bit more detail than you need. One of the things I've come across over the years is that the phone companies like to throw acronyms around, and they use them to bamboozle their clients. I happen to like the word bamboozle, which is why it's in the slide. But I've put the top 5 on this list. It's the ones I hear over and over again. It might help you the next time you have to pick up the phone and call your telephone company. First one on the list here is CO. It's short for Central Office. Now that's the closest physical telephone equipment location that the phone company has to where you are. And central offices are linked together also. We won't get into that, but typically on the mainland it's like a little small brick building or some place where it's close by to where you are. Now the transport is what it takes to get the service from the central office, which is the closest location, to your office, to your building, your office building. And that's usually done with copper wire in the ground. It's usually done through copper wire on a pole. It's done through fiber, whatever. The transport is getting from point A to point B. Transport is a major pain point when it comes to construction. If a large machine digs up a wire in the ground, they've damaged the transport, you will be out of service. So transport can be a tricky subject, but all in all, they're going to call it transport. Then there's something called the Empo, which is the minimum point of entry. This is where the lines coming from the central office physically enter the property. Oftentimes it's next to the demarc, so we'll get there, but the minimum point of entry is where it gets into the office building, and then next to that, or close by to that, is typically the demarc. This is the customer demarcation. This is where the lines, they're terminated for the customer. Terminated means the phone company hands it off to you. And that can be via a phone jack or a block that has a bunch of wire on it. That's called 66 block. But the idea is that the phone company is going to give service from their central office. They're going to transport it over to your business. They're going to plug it in at the minimum point of entry. Then at the customer demarc, that's where it's up to you to make sure it works. So if you have a tall office building, the demarc is downstairs in the basement. It's up to you to make sure that the wires go from the basement to the 30th floor. That's all you. So it really depends on how you've set up that service with the phone company. Lastly, there's something called translations. Translations, this is how your phone service is programmed to work. If you have a rotary group or a round-robin hunt group where there's phones being answered or in a group or a series that's going around in a circle, you can have that. Whether it's programmed to have caller ID and so on. So, for example, if your caller ID is not working, you can call up the phone company and say, I have a translations issue with my business phone service. My phone caller ID is not working. And they'll say, okay, great. We understand your language now. We're going to send this over to our translations group, and they will figure it out for you. I hope that helps. Some of these acronyms are probably pretty useful, and it's not something you'll come across very often, so this list is also available for download at the end of the presentation. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time on voice over IP. And this is what it really means is that you're transmitting your voice over the Internet Protocol. The Internet Protocol, by the way, works within your office and outside of your office. So voice over IP typically is reference to making a phone call over the Internet or sending voice over the Internet as you're listening to me now, but it may not necessarily be used like that. We'll go over that a little bit later. But the idea is you're using a digital data network to transport your voice instead of old-fashioned copper lines. There's quite a bit of difference between traditional service and voice over IP service. This is a unbiased view of some of the pros and cons of both. I like to first start with monthly service fee. This is not the cost. There is a distinction. The cost of something can be very high even if the monthly service fee is very low. I'll explain that. If something doesn't work reliably, if something breaks down a lot, if something gives you trouble frequently, it has a high cost associated with it and lost business, not necessarily the service fee. So I think everyone is fairly well versed in traditional phone service, how much it costs, and the pricing is fairly standard. And the attraction to voice over IP, or at least the initial attraction, is the cost. It can be anywhere from 10 to 25% less, and that can be very, very beneficial to a business, especially if there's a lot of long-distance phone calls. In terms of reliability, I think we all are pretty well understood in terms of what to expect with traditional phone service. However, voice over IP, this is one of its Achilles heels. This is a disadvantage with voice over IP, mainly because it depends a lot on internet quality. So some clients can have voice over IP and never have a problem. Others, endless problems. It really depends on the internet quality. Depends on where their location are, either on the island, mainland, so on. What the speed is of the internet, and a few other factors that we're going to go through in a later slide. And this also applies to voice quality. Voice quality can be fantastic on a internet connection, on a voice over IP connection, or it can be worse. It really depends on how good the internet is. Faxing and alarm systems, these are kind of a hidden gotcha with voice over IP services. They work fine with traditional services, but you plug a fax machine into a voice over IP line, you may have intermittent or problematic issues with doing this. Flexibility, this is where voice over IP shines. Now, if you have traditional phone service and you want to move offices, for example, it sometimes involves doing rewiring in the ceiling, and it involves going into the walls, hiring a contractor. Any sort of move is not that simple. And voice over IP is extremely simple. All you have to do is plug it into another data jack. So you can move it, you can reprovision them. The phones themselves are more sophisticated than a standard, boring, traditional line. And so they can be reused and reused and reused, and they're much better. So that's a really good selling point of voice over IP. In terms of management, if you have a traditional PBX, that's a phone system in your office, that often requires specialized skills. They do go out of date. They do break down. Some PBXs are no longer being made. It's trouble to get parts. That can be a real problem from a traditional standpoint. However, voice over IP, a lot of times the features that you would get in a PBX are usually included with the service, as well as the management and support of that. And in terms of features, this is the last selling point. Traditional is the sky's the limit. If you pay, the more you pay, typically, the more you get. Voice over IP, this is a primary selling point. A small business can usually get enterprise-level features included with their service without paying that much more. It can make your business seem much larger than it is, get more features, and sometimes that's very attractive right up front. But then again, as you can see, there are some downsides and there's some upsides to doing either service. Now, I think one of the best ways to really figure out what's going on is to look at what others are doing. So there's a voice over IP survey that was just recently taken. This was last year. And they surveyed companies with revenues of less than $100 million and found that more than half of these prospective buyers were really investing in voice over IP service for the very first time. Buyers were really concerned with the reliability and scalability, especially as their business grows, when they're looking for service. And the last key finding was that most voice over IP buyers were interested in a hosted solution versus putting a traditional phone system or something big and bulky in their office. Let's look at what industries are buying. Top of the list is professional services. That's roughly a third. And the fascinating find was that the interest in voice over IP was not particularly restricted to industries you would commonly associate with high call volume, such as retail offices and call centers. There is a lot of kind of miscellaneous there on our chart, but there seems to be a small scattering of healthcare and retail and contact center and manufacturing. All the other smaller markets are still there, but still professional services seems to be the growing lion's share. That seems to be the highest interest in voice over IP. Top requested features. This was actually a surprise. Clients still request good voicemail. Now, industry analysts have been talking about this for decades. They've been saying voicemail is dead. Google Voice has a fascinating product, and so do other providers, where they can take a voicemail message and convert it to text and text it to you. Hasn't really taken off. Really weird. So having really good voicemail, still at the top of the list, voice over IP or not. That may also indicate a pain point in that perhaps other providers don't provide very good voicemail. Voice over IP is a good alternative. One thing, then of course that drops off down to caller ID, voicemail to email, which is as a voicemail comes in, having it sent out to an email address. The ability to have some additional features such as find me or follow me. What that means is that when a phone call is not answered, then it gets forwarded to your cell phone so that you're always available. IVR, which is interactive voice response, press 1 for this, 2 for that, 3 for this, music on hold. Now, one thing I did notice was omitted from the survey was efaxing. It's something we hear from our clients that they are interested in. What that means is that instead of having a dedicated fax machine and waiting by the fax machine and getting transmission errors in the fax machine, they can get rid of that for once and for all and have the phone service simply answer those faxes and send it to you by email. Easy, fun, works great, and it's a tremendous cost savings. There's not a lot of faxing that goes on these days anymore. I'm sure you'll agree. There's very few industries that really use it on a day-to-day basis. Probably interested in who's buying this stuff. It's not the IT people. That's the interesting find. Usually it's the owner, upper management, and as you can see here, it's over 80%. The IT department is only 6%. So they're the ones perhaps pushing for this the hardest, but really it's the owner and the management who's got the final say. In terms of numbers, now this may be perhaps a limitation of the internet bandwidth or internet issues, but shows here that 62% get 9 or less phones for their organization. That's the majority, of course, and that probably is a reflection of the size of the companies that are actually buying this stuff in the first place. 59%, so almost 2/3, have less than 10 employees. That's a small to medium-sized business. That's what most of Hawaii's business community comprises of, less than 10 employees. And there is this demand for this high demand for employee extensions. Employee extensions are extension 100 for sales, 101 for customer service, 103 for marketing, etc. So those extensions, even though they may only be tied to one employee at one desk, it makes the company seem perhaps larger than it is. And if you're looking to inflate yourself, look better, improve your presence, it's a good way to do it. So let's go over some conclusions of this survey. I think you'll find them pretty valuable. There is still a shift towards voice over IP, but many businesses still rely on traditional phone service, cell phones. I don't think cell phones are going anywhere. Just be aware that important conversations are best had over a good quality phone connection. Having it on your cell phone may make you seem a little less professional. We found that clients are interested in adding users to their network cheaply as they grow, being able to scale, being able to move the extensions around. If they're moving offices, not go through the headache of rewiring and installation and so on, being able to plug it into an internet jack is highly valuable. Buyers are also not IT professionals. So anything that an IT professional would need to do, they would prefer to have it done by someone else. So reliability, technical support, programming, and so on, best handled outsourced. And there is also a high interest in unified communications. Unified communications, I mentioned here, are voicemail to email, fax to email, and so on. But they're also interested in other features, such as unified instant messaging. They're also interested in unified email, unified desktop applications. So rather than going to 3 or 4 different vendors, I didn't include those statistics because I thought it'd be a little confusing, but rather than go to many different vendors for for their solutions, they'd rather go to one vendor who has phone service, instant messaging, and so on, all packaged into one, all on one bill, all at the lowest price. I remember a few minutes ago we were going through some scenarios that you may have come across in your adventures and calling businesses. And remember, I mentioned that you tried to talk to a business on the phone, and there's delays in them hearing you, there's echoes, the sound is choppy, there's drop calls. There's a good thing that your brain does that can allow you to still continue to operate. It's called auditory illusion. And what your brain can do is fill in the gaps, and that's to understand the conversation when parts of the audio are missing. And you get that in crowded environments. You get that so that it's an adaptive feature. And our brain does this, so even if the audio stream is not 100%, your brain can still fill in the gaps, but it's working to do this. My key point to you is this. The more you make your customers work to understand you over the phone, the more unprofessional you are perceived to be. I will repeat that. The more you make your customers work to understand you over the phone, the more unprofessional you are perceived to be. That means if you're talking on a cell phone and they have to work to hear you, less professional. If you have a poor voice over IP connection, less professional. If you have a noisy environment and they have trouble hearing you, voice over IP or standard phone service, whatever, less professional. And of course, lastly, we went over the unclear speech pattern. That means that if your staff is not 100% sure of how to answer the call, how to transfer the call, it's going to make you look unprofessional. Now, we have some unique challenges to voice over IP in Hawaii, and this is why it ties into our previous slide, is that there are many these low-cost voice over IP providers on the mainland. Some you may have heard of are Vonage, Business, 8x8, Intermedia. This is a service that's sold at Costco. That's just to name a few, and there's new ones coming up all the time. Voice over IP is becoming a commodity. Anyone can do it, relatively low startup cost, and sell at a competitive price. Some of these low-cost providers can offer you 808 numbers. We only have, of course, one area code in the state. However, many of them have their facilities, so where they actually answer the calls, on the mainland. Remember I was talking about transport earlier? Think of this. If you get service from one of these budget providers here, you're looking at about a 5,000-mile round trip just to call a fellow employee. That's assuming that the low-cost provider has their equipment in California. I did a little test here with Google Maps. I showed it's around 2,400 miles just to get to San Francisco. So, if you call the person in the next office and you get echoes, hum, actually no, it would be more like echoes, warbling sounds, any sort of delays in the conversation, that's because of the distance. That's a unique challenge we have here in Hawaii. But the good news is that local providers of voice over IP have local equipment. So vendors like Hawaiian Telecom recently acquired Systemetrics. There's Surfpack, there's Aloha Tone. These are all local providers. They have local points of presence, and they can avoid that extremely long round trip. Downside, of course, is we do live in paradise, so pricing is maybe a little bit higher than mainland voice over IP providers. And I've also seen multi-year contracts in place. So higher cost, multi-year contract, and it still depends on having a good internet connection. So at the end of the day, if you have an excellent internet connection, you work with a local provider, you're probably going to be just fine. Now, I keep throwing around this internet connection. If you don't have a good internet connection, voice over IP won't work. Well, what does make a good internet connection? And most of our listeners, I assume, do not know what makes a good internet connection. They just know speed. Speed is what is advertised at the top of the list. This is what most internet service is sold using these numbers. So, I've seen like 10 and 1, which is 10 megabits down, 1 megabit up, 15 megabits down, 1 megabit up, and so on. The 1 megabit, that's where your actual voice quality is going through. Now, 1 meg is actually quite a bit. You can do quite a bit with 1 meg upload. But there are other things that make a good internet connection that will affect the voice quality. Second is latency. Latency is how long things take to respond. Now, the best analogy I could come up with is that, say you call your friend on their cell phone. How many rings does that cell phone need to ring before they pick it up? The internet works sort of the same way. So when your phone tries to go out and send your voice to the person on the other end of the line, how long does it take to kind of get there? And that latency is what can cause echoes. That latency is what can cause the line quality to be very poor. That can cause delays in the conversation that actually makes it hard to really have a conversation with the person on the other end. Now, the last thing here is uptime. Now, uptime is kind of a picky subject. It's kind of hairy. There's something called a service level agreement that internet providers should provide customers. And it's something typically you have to ask for. Many times they don't offer it right up front. Now, an SLA is not typically offered with residential internet service. What that means is that it can go up or down as much as they choose, and that's pretty much it. But if you're a business and you're depending on your internet to do your voice calls, your speed may be great, your latency may be very low. However, if it's down all the time, what good is it? Right? So a typical service level agreement may say something like, in a business environment, they can offer you 99.9% uptime. What that translates to is about almost 4 days worth of downtime without any penalty to the provider. There's higher level SLAs. There's something called the 5 nines. That's the kind of the gold standard. That's 99.999% uptime. But typically that comes at a higher cost, and you should perhaps ask for that from your internet provider. It's called an SLA, service level agreement. Ask your internet provider for an SLA, a service level agreement. That will tell you what your remediation steps are if the internet does go down, and how much downtime is acceptable from the provider's perspective. Now, I'd like to offer you a third approach. Obviously, we've looked at traditional phone service, we looked at voice over IP phone service, and there could be something else, which is called the hybrid approach. This combines the best of both worlds. Why would you consider something like this for your organization? It's a good question. Lots of people use this method. In fact, large businesses prefer this method. For example, hospitals, for example, schools, police departments, fire departments, government, state facilities. And I know when I was working back at Best Buy, we had a system like this as well. I took some pictures of some of the commonly used phones. I see these at the DMV. And there's a Polycom, there's a Cisco there. What they do is they use the internal network of the actual building to transmit the calls, right? So they use voice over IP inside, and then when it comes to dialing out to the outside world, they either use a hybrid approach of perhaps voice over IP for long distance, and then traditional lines for inbound and outbound local calls, or they kind of move them around based on what's best for that environment. It makes it the most flexible. They could take advantage of all the scalability and flexibility advantages of voice over IP, and all the reliability and really the simplicity of traditional telecom. It's what makes the most amount of sense, and it's the most reliable, and sometimes it's not the cheapest, but it is overall sometimes the most cost effective. The best thing I can offer you is perhaps a case study, a story of a local business that did it right. We worked with Celebrity Tuxedos to put in a hybrid system approach for them. Picture that you see there is for Ron Bongiovanni. He's the president of Celebrity Tuxedos. They're a fantastic company. They've been around for decades. They do tuxedo rentals all throughout the island, and they have typically pretty high call volume, and they're seasonal business, and they need to be able to provide the absolute best customer service to their clients, and they do, and they have been for some time. They have 3 retail locations, and they have 1 large plant in Kapolei. And one of their frustrations was with an antiquated phone system. So they didn't have caller ID, they didn't have the ability to transfer calls, the voicemail wasn't really all that good. And the problem with some of these antiquated phone systems is that they may not be really all that old, but they still may not have support. They still may not have upgrades. They still may not have parts. Telecom industry can be a little bit volatile. And this particular business had been sold and sold again, and so it was very difficult to find actual service support and upgrades for what they had. In addition, their plant had sort of unreliable internet, and that made them nervous about switching to a completely voice over IP solution. And one thing about voice over IP is that sometimes the per seat pricing model it is a little bit more expensive than going with with something else. And the way that works is, say for instance, you have a business and you have 10 phones and everything's okay. Well, if you have 10 phones and you pay, say $45 per month for 10 phones, so you're $450. Now, if you have a trunk system where you have 5 phone lines and 10 phones, you're just paying for those 5 phone lines, and those 10 phones have a relatively low cost. Overall, it can be a lot lower. So the per seat model can become more expensive with voice over IP, and this is where you want to ask your provider for price breaks based on volume. So, anyways, they did have some traditional telephone lines. However, they were not really being utilized correctly, or they were utilized for small things like faxing and maybe a dedicated credit card line and so on. And so they were paying a lot of fees for extra lines that they weren't really using. Now, here's the key. Lacking phone features. That leaves room for significant improvements. It's not a problem. It's an opportunity. They can improve their customer service by simply improving their technology. There's a big gap. Once they fill that gap, customer service goes up. So let's see what happened. What we first did is we sat down, we did a complete phone bill review. We identified a good cost-saving strategy. Next, we figured out that keeping some of the existing phone lines, upgrading their internet, and using voice over IP for long distance, that would make things A, the most reliable, and B, the most cost-effective. Then we installed a replacement hybrid PBX. Picture there on the right shows their traditional PBX, which is that beige box on the wall. Next to it is the black box with the reg tag. As you can tell, hybrid PBXs are relatively small. They do the job, and we installed it without any real trouble. Now the hybrid PBX uses the existing data network. It uses that for the phones, so we didn't have to rewire the whole building. And voice over IP and existing phone lines are kind of mixed in together for long distance calls. That is the most reliable strategy. Now, funny thing is, a few weeks after we installed the system, there was a major problem with the telecommunications company, and they couldn't make phone calls using their traditional phone lines. We were able to switch them onto voice over IP entirely, 100% temporarily, while the phone company fixed their issue and switched them back, and there was relatively very little interruption in service. That's a perfect example of how a hybrid system can adapt to issues that are outside of your control. Lastly, we made sure everything is on battery backups. That made it so that in the event of any sort of power fluctuation, there would be no loss in service to their existing customers. We also disconnected their fax line. They now use Efax, so rather than have a dedicated line for that, paying quite a bit, that all went away. We set up voicemail to email, so now their staff gets their voicemail messages on their phones, and for key personnel only got that. And we also set up these rollover lines. This is actually pretty valuable. What this means is that a call is always answered by someone if that extension is busy or they're unavailable. That's a huge, huge thing for customer service. Customers want to get someone on the phone. Why not give them the choice? Put in professional music on hold. We also put in this phone paging system, so the phones have the ability to page each other through the phones. It seems to be a feature that many clients know about, but they perhaps don't use it as much. It's very useful, especially in a bigger company. And then we integrated the ability of the IVR to send calls to offsite stores. Now, an IVR, remember we were talking about interactive voice response, they answer these common customer questions, and then it can route sales calls to stores and customer service calls to the plant. So most of the calls that they were getting were from clients wanting to know if their tuxedo is ready for pickup. Well, that can interrupt the store if they're working with an existing customer there in the store. So now the plant can answer that question for them. You know, there's nothing more rude than having a retail rep talking on the phone in front of a customer in a retail setting. This eliminated that, improved the customer service. Let's look at the results, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. We had a greater than 50% reduction in in-store calls. So common questions, where you're located, hours of operation, where do I park, all answered by the interactive voice response. Now, the retail employees have less distractions, and they offer a better customer experience to those customers in the store. We decrease the answer time to get someone on the phone itself. You know, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, most calls are for the status of an order. And we have improved sound quality. We have better features such as caller ID. We can park and transfer calls. And at the end of the day, the employees are happier with it. You know, it's much simpler to ask an employee to do their job when they have the proper tools to do so. And of course, the owners were the most happy when they had a $14,844 immediate annual savings on their phone bills. So my question to you is this. That's an inspiring story, but do you think that there's any changes that they are ready for, that they're prepared for, that now that they can now do now that they have this hybrid phone system? Charles Darwin said, "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." The Technical Advisory Council, that's to the FCC, they recommended back in 2011 that the FCC set a date to sunset the PSTN, which is the Public Switch Telephone Network, in 2018. They recommended that they do this rather than let the phone network fade into oblivion. Now, I doubt that 2018 is going to be the year when everything goes away, but really, copper is expensive to maintain. Subscriptions are falling. The case that was made was that it's primarily for rural communities and aging communities. In my opinion, I don't think it's going to go away completely, but there are new technologies that take advantage of the internet. The hybrid approach that Celebrity Tuxedos picked up makes them most adaptable to change and able to take advantage of new and upcoming technologies without being tied into really long-term contracts. So what I'd like to offer you since we have a webinar going on here for just Better Business Bureau members, I'd like to make this offer out to Better Business Bureau members that are listening. We'd like to do a quick, it's called a phone system review. Now, in this business phone review, we'll go through, look at your system today, what's keeping you up at night. We'll offer you some solutions in terms of figuring out where you're paying for underutilized services. Maybe write down what your business objectives are, what you'd like to accomplish from a customer service or expansion perspective, and then making a roadmap to get there. Finding out what has been the impact of these missed opportunities to your business, figuring out how we can minimize telecommunication costs and really stop the bleed. And what this will do for you is to give you an action plan, figure out how you can use new technologies based on where they're appropriate, and improve your customer service. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to grow your business. There are three things you do need to know about this, though. When it comes to business phone reviews, I would love to offer this to everyone, but the reality is I only have so many hours in the day, so I can only extend this to 12 people. So please only sign up if you're truly and genuinely serious about being more strategic with your phones. Don't sign up if you're mildly curious. I also want you to know that there won't be any heavy sales pressure to buy anything or to work with me. Now, of course, some of you may decide that you want to hire us and work with us, but that's your decision. All I want to do is provide you a lot of value, answer your questions, show you some ways to be smarter and more strategic about your telecom investments, and for many of you, uncover some big flaws that you might not have been aware of. And finally, there's an application process for the consultation, and that's because number one, I want to make sure I can help you, and number two, there's some information I'll need to get about you and your organization before we schedule the first meeting to help me prepare for our time together and to make the meeting as productive as possible. What to do now is to go out and get your 10 questions report. It's free. This is something I recommend you read right away before you pay another phone bill. The website for that is www.soshawaii.com/secretphone. And there you're also going to find some of the additional notes that we had here in the presentation, including the top 10 things that you do not want to be giving out to your customers on the phone. And that concludes our presentation. Of course, the website there is soshawaii.com/secretphone to download that. And if we have any Q&A, I see that we did have a question earlier from Chris. And if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the chat window there on the right-hand side of your screen. The question I had here from Chris was, have you heard of UMA phone service? That's OOMA. I've seen it at Costco, and they also have phone service for business. Well, Chris, like I said earlier, you get what you pay for, and there's tons and tons of low-cost voice-over IP providers are popping up every day on the mainland. So UMA probably has all their connections to the telephone network on the mainland. Remember that 5,000-mile trip I was telling you about? That's going to apply to you. And there are other providers that have been around for years. Same idea. Magic Jack, for example, is one of them. I wouldn't really trust my business with it. I know I did some investigation into UMA some time back, and they were primarily focused on selling equipment and then amortizing the cost of the service kind of into the one big equipment purchase. Some people like that, some people don't. It really depends. But all in all, I would recommend if you're going to go with a voice over IP provider, go with a name you know and with a name that has a reputation. I think you'll be okay. All right, I don't see any other questions that have come up here. So with that, we'll conclude the conversation. Thank you very much, Ronald.
Thank you, Tilla, for your time and for sharing important information. Mahalo to all of you who participated. We're glad you joined us today. A brief survey will appear on your screen shortly. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a few minutes to tell us what you thought of this webinar. And feel free to get in touch with us at any time. Our contact information is on your screen. And thank you again, and aloha.